I wouldn't have been able to have that chance or that opportunity to know a person like that unless I was, in a school like Escuela Internacional Sampedrana. And that's very, very, very important because, day by day in the US, I'm not going to create a connection like that or a friendship like that at the supermarket or, at a convention or at a networking event. Like that's not really how those, I guess, genuine, authentic connections come out of or arise, which for international students, when they go to college, I think that's an important thing they need to do and seek.
Welcome to episode 76 of Tokyo Alumni Podcast. Today we have a special guest, our second international school graduate outside of Tokyo. He is an American national born and raised in San Pedro Sula, Honduras. During his time in Honduras, he attended the SERAN Bilingual School, Escuela Internacional La Lima, and eventually graduated from Escuela Internacional Sampedrana in 2015. He earned a bachelor's degree in business administration from Northeastern University. During his time at Northeastern, he was involved with the Idea Venture Studio on campus and did co-ops in accounting and asset management. During his senior year at Northeastern, he was part of the founding of Disrupt, the Fintech Initiative at Northeastern, aimed at building a community on campus at the intersection of finance and technology. He now works as an associate at the early stage banking team at Silicon Valley in San Francisco, learning and building relationships with young startups, founders, and investors from the Bay Area. Welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Thank you, Nick. It's very nice to talk to you on this new year. But from my perspective, it's very nice to chat with an old friend, an old teacher. And in terms of, your audience in Tokyo, very nice to meet all of you. I have not spent much time in Asia, but I've heard great things from friends, from family. But also I'd love to hear from Nick exactly how good your experience has been there.
Yeah, it's great to connect with you in this modality. I think the last time we spoke was probably, we speak online sometimes, but in this sort of context, audio-wise, it's been a while. And it's great to hear off air. We spoke a bit how you're currently in Florida, but earlier before that, you were in California. As I mentioned in the bio, you work in San Francisco. Chris Harris is usually not the name people think of when they think about someone from Honduras. I'm sure you get that a lot.
Yeah, I get that all the time, especially if I'm speaking Spanish to people. They just don't expect, my proficiency in Spanish. I think that it's a great advantage to be able to speak multiple languages. It tells an interesting aspect about yourself to other people without communicating your background, without communicating where you're from. It just says that, hey, this is a person that can communicate in multiple languages. And I think that for most people, that's a very interesting element.
And a lot of our guests have been third culture children. And, you obviously have spent more of your life in Honduras than in the United States. Do you identify stronger with Honduran culture than American culture?
That's a thing that I guess I think about all the time. And it kind of swings, right? It's more on, where exactly I'm located and how I'm interacting with the real world. If it's with family, I most definitely resonate more with Honduran culture, whether it's through food, whether it's through, old stories and memories and such. But if it's, more in a social aspect, or if it's more in real world current terms, I, resonate more with American culture because that is where I live. That is where, I work. And you just have to keep up with the world around you, right? And especially living in the US, now I'm turning 7 years this year. The world in the US changes drastically, quicker, more than any other place in the world, in my opinion. From one year to the next, there could be a massive shift, whether it's culturally, socially, politically, that in other places you just don't see as aggressively. And, looking back in the last 7 years and all the stuff that's happened, especially with the pandemic and other issues as well, I think that from a more real world standpoint, I do resonate more with American culture. But in terms of my past, I think of myself more as a ethnically Latin person. So I try to explain it in I'm a American citizen born and raised abroad, and that I guess opens up the conversation with other people as to where exactly those I guess lines fall.
That's really interesting how you mentioned this concept of code switching, which I think is quite familiar with TCKs and, people who are biracial, bicultural. Do you feel like it's easier to, sort of engage in that code switching culturally, being that you're in a rather heterogeneous part of the United States, which is San Francisco?
That's a good question. I think it's kind of challenging because with people, it's more of like birds of a feather flock together. So if you're speaking Spanish and that's the medium of communication, most of the people around you are going to be speaking Spanish and they're going to have the same type of background as you. But if you're speaking primarily English, most of the people will not be speaking Spanish, right? So there's that, I guess, big difference of all the things that come with that language barrier. And I constantly see myself either challenging myself to be more involved with either side because it, I guess, lets me access different parts of myself, but also, it kind of helps me set the tone for anything that I'm thinking of or focusing on or challenging myself for, whether it's at work, whether it's just socially, or even if it could be in this manner, like, we're doing now, which I think that I'm not trying to be a little bit of a generalist, but in English, there's more of this free thought of speech, right? Where you can engage in conversation with people of any medium. In Spanish, that's more limited to, I'll only do that with close people that I know, right? That I can have that level of trust. And that's kind of just one insight of being part of, two different cultures. And I bet you probably experienced something very similar, right? Being with an experience in America and an experience in Asia in terms of the different underlying themes of each culture there.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Especially, I'm happy you mentioned the point of language because I think that's a reoccurring theme. And, especially Japanese is very different from English. And I think it does eventually actually affect people's personality. There's sort of that stereotype of Japanese woman voice is kind of being higher. And I've had actually a lot of my friends who are half, white, half Japanese, half American, half Japanese. They've told me even their voices change. When they're speaking Japanese, their voices get higher and kind of a bit more cute, sounding voice. And then maybe when they're speaking English, it gets, one notch lower and assertive. And obviously that then affects your personality in a way. So yeah, I think that idea that language is important. And I guess I naively very much kind of assumed because Spanish and English are so similar that maybe there was less of a difference, but it sounds like the difference is quite grand.
Yeah, the difference is it's pretty stark, and especially like if you think about it in a professional setting, right? I feel like when you share English as a common language with people have that precognition bias of professionalism because English being, I guess, the most used language in the world in terms of business or academics. But then in Spanish, if you meet people in a professional setting with Spanish, it's more of like, okay, professionalism comes down one level. Let's interact in more of a personal level. Let's, share, information about ourselves. And I've had that happen with multiple coworkers where, we're all working remote. We don't meet each other in person. But when I did come across them in person over coffee or lunch, and I used my Spanish with them, it would just switch like that. It would be we'd be discussing our personal beliefs. We'd be discussing our past. We'd be discussing who we are as people. But that's just my experience, right? But then I also think that location has something to do with that in terms of where you are. If you look at, from my experience, West Coast versus East Coast, I lived in Boston for 5 years, and I've been living in the West Coast for now 2 years. That's also pretty drastic, I guess, change from one spectrum to the other as to how you share your own, I guess, what is yourself to other people over conversation. Because in the East Coast, it's not the same as it is in the West Coast. In the East Coast, people, I guess, have more of a tendency of, as they say, sizing you up. who you are in terms of like what demonstrates who you are, versus I think in the West Coast, it's more about, I want to know who you are by you telling me who you are. I want to learn about your background, your experiences, where you come from. And I guess that's, something that's very true with California as a whole, right? Because California is just one large melting pot
Yeah.
for the US. And the East Coast, it's a lot more, smaller groups of people from different backgrounds.
So when it comes to, international school graduates in Honduras, and maybe to a certain degree, Central America, because I know there's a lot of similarity with the schools there in Guatemala, Nicaragua, is for those students who do make it to, who do choose to attend university in the States, is there that conversation in regards to which states? Because just to give a quick background, being, in the Asia part of things now for 8 years in Korea, as well as a year in Japan, is, students like California, they like Boston. Of course, they go to other parts of the, states, but for Asian nationals or people, coming from Asian cultures, it's incredibly smooth, or it's a smoother transition, let's say, to go to San Francisco in comparison to going to North Dakota. Of course, there's more schools in San Francisco too. But in that sense, for Hondurans and Central Americans, are there certain states where, Hondurans tend to congregate more, or is there really no patterns like that?
I think there are, and very similar to what you said, right? The transition for Asian students to California is a lot easier. And I know a bunch of people who are either second generation Chinese or second generation Korean that are from the Bay Area. And, they have been living in the Bay Area their entire lives. And then I kind of peek into their world in terms of like, what's Asian culture like in California? And a lot of them say, coming to California from Asia is just an easy transition. There's such a large community and a rich background, a rich heritage, a rich sense of heritage and belonging. And I think that determines why people go to study in California from Asia so easily, whether it's SoCal, NorCal. Then I think in Central America, they tend to go to a few destinations that are popular, and California isn't one of them. California is not, a destination where a large group of graduates from Central America are confident, or I guess just even thinking or considering about, simply because people don't necessarily go there from Central America for school. People go there for more holiday or more of a vacation type of experience. But in the East Coast for school, because there's such a large international element of either if it's acceptance or just composition of students, of applicants, people feel more comfortable in applying and going to those schools. And like I said, in terms of heritage, you look at all these students who their parents, their older cousins, their older siblings went to those locations, right? Whether it's Boston, New York, Philadelphia, or even just smaller locations like either Charlotte or Houston in the South as well. It's very popular to go to like Texas, Florida, Georgia, and then, maybe go up into the DC area, the tri-state area, and up into New England. And then you have some people who may go to Chicago. Chicago is also very popular. But, from my experience, Boston was just, a massive community of people, not only from Central America, but also South America.
So going back to Honduras, you mentioned people's perspective of Honduras. And one question I wanted to ask you was, what is the most common misconception people have about Honduras?
It's a great question. The greatest misconception about Honduras would be very similar to any like underdeveloped country, which is because it's undeveloped, there's no since it's underdeveloped, there's no sense of community, there's no sense of culture, there's no sense of life, right? You think that there's all these terrible things going on there, but in Honduras there's great things going on, right? And at least from my perspective, when I meet people from other places that is not Honduras, for example, which is a place that I'm familiar with, like for example Brazil. Whenever I come across a person from Brazil, I want to learn as much as I can from Brazil, from what they can share with me, because you hear all these misconceptions about how terrible of a place Brazil is because the high level of corruption and the extreme level of malpractice that happens, right? And I guess that's just one example. It's similar to Honduras, where everybody says, look at the large levels of corruption. It's a mess down there, or whatever the I guess generalization would be. But I think that for misconceptions, the number one would be corruption, which it may be with some level of truth. But I also think that it's more about there's no real sense of life there. People only take the negatives and don't necessarily consider the positives. And especially with the U.S. culture and how people view things here, they like to focus a lot on the negatives, right? And you can see it even within our own borders. People fight with each other all the time, even if it's between from one state to the other, and want to emphasize on how terrible it is in California and how terrible it is in such state and how terrible it is in another state. But it's usually not as bad as people think. So I think that's the misconception. It's not as bad as people think.
So you attended not one, but 3 different international schools in Honduras. What took your parents to Honduras, and how did your experiences compare, at these 3 schools, which were the SERAN Bilingual School, La Lima campus, and the Sampedrana campus?
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty crazy tale, I guess. So my dad arrived in Honduras, I think, in the early 90s. And, it wasn't as bad as people thought, right? It was a great place, had a lot of opportunity. It was safe. There was some level of excitement between the population. And then he started actually working at EIS as a teacher for, I think it was 6 months he worked there. And then, fast forward 20 years later, he's got a family, he's got kids. We're all, born and raised in Honduras, but because of the previous law of having kids abroad outside of the US, if you were an American citizen, you would get automatic citizenship if you were to be raised, in the US when you were a kid, right? I think Obama changed that in his presidency. But coming back, so in Honduras, so my dad, he was a teacher at EIS for a few years, and then when he started enrolling us into schools, he looked at SERAN, which was the I guess second largest school in San Pedro Sula, if you were to put it that way in terms of size. And SERAN was run by a American administration from the top level, right? So the school's president or chairman or whatever you want to call it. Can't remember her name, but she was an American, and she hired and she recruited a bunch of American and Canadian teachers. And I was there till about the 2nd grade, I think. Great experiences there. Learned a lot, and the school was a lot smaller than EIS. I think that the class size was only about like less than 30 people. And then after that, I went to Escuela Internacional La Lima, which is the second campus, right, outside of San Pedro Sula. And I don't really know why we went to La Lima instead of San Pedro. I think it may have been an issue with occupancy, but I think also my parents believed in La Lima a little more than they did with San Pedro, because we had, family and friends that had been to La Lima, that had, graduated from La Lima, and their experience and their results were, I guess at a higher scale than EIS. And then I went over to San Pedro, and San Pedro was, I guess, my experience or my way of experiencing going into a larger high school, similar to what happens in the US, right? You graduate middle school and then you go into that large high school, large public school that has, either 300 students in the class, 500 students in the class, or up to maybe 1,000 students in the class. At first, it was definitely very intimidating to be in a high school of 450 people. The school that I was in for 5 years prior was only 100 people, the entire school. You knew every single student. But then going into San Pedro, I mean, I thought that there were great opportunities there. There were great people there. I met a lot of great students there, and a lot of smart people, and a lot of people who wanted to improve themselves as well, just as much as La Lima, if not more. And there are also the right resources at San Pedro, particularly just with the clubs that were offered there. I think that, that was probably the best program in all of San Pedro Sula in terms of opportunities for students to improve themselves outside of the classroom. And I think that every international student or every international school develops their students with that type of curriculum in mind. And I have met many international students from other schools that share that same common theme. I did Asia, or I was a sports leader and went to multiple countries, or I was an MUN, or I was in knowledgeable and I excelled outside of the classroom there as well as I did in the classroom. And then they went on to build great either academic experiences and academic credentials, or go into the professional world straight out of or in between school and just try to push themselves. But I think that was, I guess, my overall experience between SERAN, La Lima, and San Pedro, and still try to keep in touch with a few people here and there. It's easier said than done. Obviously, you would know you're in the other side of the world, and it must be very difficult to keep in touch with people. But with the people that you can and you try to, it's always fun to catch up with each other.
Yeah, I agree that the way extracurriculars are set up at international schools have always amused me. And to be quite honest, so you were part of, a very integral part of MUN, which is a very much academic group. And I remember when people told me you played sports, I just kind of assumed maybe you did a little bit of badminton, or something very non-contact. And then I no, he's like, I think you were captain or something. And I was like kids can do both, because even at my high school, looking back, there were students like that. There were students who were, the lead of theater in the spring, or the musical in the spring, but they were also American football, like quarterback in the fall.
You want to know why I think that happens? It's because there's a shortage of students. There's a shortage of students, and it requires students to say, screw it, I'll do it. I'll try it out. Whatever comes out of it, we'll see what happens. And yeah, like you say, right? When would you hear that an NHS student is also in the volleyball, the basketball team, and in the ASIA program, and they go to, a great university simply because they have all these components of their academic experience in high school. And I think that most definitely will result in higher test scores, will definitely result in better conversational skills with people. You'll understand people a lot better than most people. You won't have that shell to you, right? Because you've put yourself in so many different challenges, and you've been able to do well in not all of them, but a few of them, and that's enough.
Yeah, I mean, do you feel like and I'll just give you my opinion first. I agree. And you were saying something earlier about how just having these like trouble solving skills that, maybe an American counterpart might not get from even, a robust American private education. And I have seen some, my friends who did go to, Northeastern schools, like, was Andover, Exeter.
Yeah.
Those are elite schools, but generally they almost kind of cheat a little bit, because it's like things that are not quite soccer or basketball. They'll be doing stuff like fencing, or like rowing, and those are intense, but it's not the same as being, in a soccer game, and because it's just they don't do those sports because they can't compete in those sports with other American schools. When you settle down somewhere, wherever that somewhere is, do you envision sending your own children to international schools?
That's a great question. I don't know how it's going to play out. Who knows? If I can, that'd be great. I think that's a great experience. But it could be a very difficult experience because not every international school is the same. And there's different things that you also have to consider when being abroad. Now, if it could be like some form of like an international boarding experience, I think that could be cool. But just the different amount of challenges of being abroad versus being in the US, that I think that for me right now, I haven't thought that far out in terms of like how to do it. But when I want to, yeah, of course. I mean, I think it's fantastic, and I see it just as an example with my roommate. He went to the international school in Bangladesh. And he was an American citizen out of Bangladesh, and all the kids that he met there were same type of background. They spoke 2, 3 different languages. Parents were of a multiracial marriage, whether it's expat from the U.S., politician from the U.S., business person from the U.S. And I ask him the same question all the time, and he looks at me and he says, "What do you think?" Obviously, I want that international experience. I mean, I can't really, sit across the table with a person that's only been, to Connecticut, New Jersey, and Delaware and say that we're the same person, right? Because I've been able to travel, I've been able to experience different religions. I know what it's like to be, in a Muslim speaking country. I know what it's like to be in a Spanish speaking country. I know what it's like to be in an English speaking country. Those experiences you can't really get out of the textbook, right? And I think that you're probably a great example of that too, right? Because you lived in Japan in high school, now you're in Korea, and you lived in the US, and that is probably true for you as well.
Yeah, I think off air, we talked a bit about competitive edge, right? Competitive advantage. And yeah, I would totally concur that, it's sort of the caution that, I think one could be monocultural and still, have certain, whatever, but there is definitely that element of that bicultural, multicultural element, which I think, to the credit of a lot of US schools, especially California, I think they try to replicate that. But I think my problem with it is that it's not authentic. And again, it's not to the fault, if you're in Northern California, I don't know, let's say you're an hour north in Napa or something, and, you have a fairly heterogeneous population there. You can have like a World Cultural Day and you can bring in Mexican food and Japanese food and Korean food.
Right.
But it's like that real authentic experience
Right.
is something that you have to, go through. And again, it looks different from international school to international school, but
yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I was able to catch up with one of you. I think he was your student, but he was also an MUN, and I actually caught up with him in Northern California, and it was so nice to see an old friend, and obviously so nice to see that across time, we were still the same person, but we'd still had lived different experiences, and our perceptions of the world were unique to our own experiences. But like you say, I wouldn't have been able to have that chance or that opportunity to know a person like that unless I was, in a school like Escuela Internacional Sampedrana. And that's very, very, very important because, day by day in the US, I'm not going to create a connection like that or a friendship like that at the supermarket or, at a convention or at a networking event. Like that's not really how those, I guess, genuine, authentic connections come out of or arise, which for international students, when they go to college, I think that's an important thing they need to do and seek. It's finding people from different cultures and just sticking to them and being loyal to them, whether you only talk a few times a semester, a few times a year, or you have every single meal together. And like in my experience at my school, there's a large amount of Indian students. I had never really, met anyone from India, right? Being in Honduras, right? You don't see Indian people there. And I had never had Indian cuisine, and I never really understood the large cultural, I guess, melting pot that India really is. And I met a lot of people there and at school, and a lot of people from there. And my senior year, I ended up working at an Indian restaurant as a part-time gig and had a
Nice.
lot of fun, and I had a lot of fun doing that. Now I go to an Indian restaurant and I know exactly what to pick out of the menu, and Indian food is a great comfort food, right? But I think that what's most important is that like now I have friends and people that if whether I'm on this side of the world or the other side of the world, I can across time catch up with them for a day or two, and still relive those past experiences, but also learn from their past experiences what it's been like for them, right? And I have friends from India who now are based out of Dubai, right? I have friends from India who are based in Nepal or in Mumbai or in Japan. And I'd like to at one point or the other have a conversation with them and call them up or meet up with them and see what their experience is like. And you don't really get that unless you go out there and try to meet people.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, that even if you don't go to international school, that opportunity exists at the collegiate level. And it's, up to the individual to really, grasp that opportunity and create a network, which hopefully, once this COVID business, if not disappears, at least, becomes less. So you can,
Right.
in fact, travel around to, Dubai and Japan
Right.
and actually link up with them, in real, first
And,
person.
I think it's important also to recognize, right, that most people would say like, oh, like I want this connection so that one day later in my life I might get some type of business interest out of it, right? And I feel like that's never the case. You'll never really hear from a person who'll say, hey, I met this person years ago, and because we were friends back then, we were able to mutually benefit out of business. I don't think that that's how it works. And people really believe that that's kind of how it works. I think it's more of like, okay, both of you met at a certain stage in your lives where you guys trusted each other to share, whether it's a school project or if it's, a sports tournament or if it's whatever type of moment, right? And then years later, you still have that sense of camaraderie and loyalty that those people will trust you enough, right?
But, as we wind down this interview, at the end, I like to ask the guests what is coming up in their lives, this coming years, decades.
Right.
I think since this is recorded first week of January of 2022,
It's a
I'd
great
like to
time for it.
focus. I like to focus on 2022. So what's to come in the next 360 days.
I think that for me, what's to come or what I'm going to be focusing on this year is just trying to prove things to myself that have nothing to do with the exterior world, whether it's building or breaking a habit, or whether it's a certain accomplishment, if it's physical or if it's more personal. But I think that for me, one of the things that I'm going to be working on this year is just dedicating more time to myself. I think that one of the things that I want to do more of is not necessarily spend alone time. That's not what I'm saying. I want to do things more for myself that will improve how I, have relationships with other people. And I think that one of the ways that I can do that is by physical activity. Like you said, I used to do a lot of sports in high school. I used to work out in college, but one of the things that I've never really considered or thought of is running a marathon. And a marathon is a great challenge to prove to yourself that hey, you can run for 4 hours. That's not an average thing. And I was talking about this with a few other friends, like, what are you thinking about for this year? And I think that if you put yourself with a goal that's physical in nature, whether it's climbing a mountain, whether it's going on hikes, whether it's waking up in the morning, whether it's cold showers, I don't know, something as trivial as that. If you do it consistently, I think that, with 4, 5, 6 months time, you'll come out the other side stronger, better. You'll, have better relationships with people around you. You'll be more grateful. Even something as simple as reading, which I've also been doing a few here and there, just different topics, just for my own curiosity, and if you need any recommendations, I can definitely throw some your way. I think that a great book that I read, or two great books that I read last year that I think you would probably like, are The Lost City of the Monkey God, which don't remember the author, but the Lost City of Monkey God is where they find, they used to call it, I think it was called the White City. They found it in Honduras, in the large jungle in the eastern side of Honduras after you left. I think it was in 2016 or 2017. You know, they made this unbelievable discovery using LiDAR technology. That's one. The Lost City of the Monkey God, great book. And then the second one, The Fish That Ate the Whale. Funny enough, both of these books are Honduras related, but The Fish That Ate the Whale is about the creation of the Standard Food Company by a Russian Jewish immigrant in Honduras. And with this very powerful company, he was able to overthrow the government. He was able to set his dominance and control. And funny enough, he is the largest donor at Tulane University. So a very, very fun tale of just, you know, the past and how it affects the future. But those are two great books, I would say.
Yeah, I like the idea that you said that, you know, if it's a concrete physical thing, you can't really weasel your way around it, right? So as you said with the marathon, I mean, now it's on record. So you have to, by December 31st, sign up for something and do it now, eh?
yeah. And I mean, I think that it's most definitely a lot of fun. It's challenging as hell, but like, you know, at least I can, you know, rub it in my friends' faces and say, all right, man, if you think you can keep up, go run a marathon and tell me how it goes. So I'm, you know, holding you to it, Nick, if you want to do it sometime.
I'll maybe start with a half marathon, but I believe the full is a 41.195, I think. I have a vague memory that 195, but yeah, it's been exciting. It's been nice to catch up with you. You're right now in Florida, eventually in California. I'm in South Korea. Who knows? Eventually, we'll probably meet up again one day. We have not met up yet since I left Honduras in 2014. 2014 spring. So, you know, hopefully our paths will cross. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Nick.
And yeah, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Hopefully one day or the other catch up in person. That would mean a lot. But you know, like I said, you know, if you're ever in California or back in the US, just keep me posted. You never know where I may be.